In my sermon this morning, I'm going to talk about anger, how it shapes us, how we can control it, and when it might be a righteous response to injustice. And while the words I've written over the past few weeks are not explicitly about Israel, it was certainly one of the sources of anger that was on my mind as I composed them. It is clearly on our minds this morning. So before I begin, it feels important to acknowledge that many in this room are sitting with acute anger over what has happened in the last few days and in the last year. And to acknowledge that our anger is often the loudest emotion, but it rarely travels without its close companions, fear and sadness. This morning, I will share with you my belief that anger is our body's defense system against injustice. But I do not want my call for righteous anger to be misconstrued as a call for vengeance. Standing up for ourselves is an act of justice. Revenge is not. On this morning of uncertainty, we have more reason than ever to examine our anger in the hopes that we might understand it better. In order to do so, let me start by sharing a story of rage. The year was 2006. Facebook had just rolled out a new feature and people were furious. The company was experimenting with ways to increase engagement, the industry term for how long they can keep users scrolling. In the early days of the site, if you wanted to know what your friends were up to, you had to click on their profile to see their most recent posts and photos. One Facebook engineer had an idea. What if when you logged in, you'd see a page with all the recent activities of your friends? They called their innovation the news feed. Almost instantly, people despised it. I joined Facebook the year before, and I remember the site suddenly felt like a fishbowl, like everyone was watching what I was doing all the time. And I was not alone. Within hours, people started to create Facebook groups like Students Against Facebook's Newsfeed and I Hate Facebook on Facebook. And when you joined these groups, the newsfeed announced it to all your friends, who could also join with a single click, which would also be announced to all of their friends. Within a day, some of these groups had grown to more than 100,000 members. A few protesters showed up at Facebook's corporate headquarters, though they were thoroughly outnumbered by satellite news vans. Seeing the crowd, the police even asked the company to consider switching off whatever had caused the commotion. Facebook's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, had to issue a public apology. Within a few weeks, though, the rage against the news feed had largely burned itself out. The truth is, only a small percentage of Facebook's users ever joined these angry groups. Only a tiny handful had shown up to protest. As journalist Max Fisher explains, digital amplification had tricked Facebook's users and even its leadership into misperceiving the platform's loudest voices as representing everyone, growing a flicker of anger into a wildfire. Despite their protestations, people didn't cancel their accounts. In fact, engagement numbers soared. Time on the site skyrocketed. New user registrations exploded by 700%. This was a watershed moment in the history of social media. Not only were other social sites quick to copy Facebook's newsfeed, but Silicon Valley had also learned a valuable lesson about what kinds of posts drove up engagement. The angriest voices, even when they represented a minuscule minority, captured everyone's attention. 20 years later, and we live in the engagement economy. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok all compete for our attention. The more engaged people are on their sites, the more ads they can sell. We are not the customers. We are the product. They sell us to advertisers. So they've cunningly designed increasingly advanced algorithms that keep us scrolling and clicking. And we're not seeing the most recent posts. We're seeing the ones they think will keep us hooked. And the posts which create the most engagement are the ones that elicit anger. A leaked internal study conducted by Facebook in 2018 states, our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. If left unchecked, they will feed users more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. The researchers proposed adjustments to the algorithm that would de-emphasize angry content, changes which might have the side effect of getting people to put down their phones and actually go outside every once in a while. Facebook's executives shelved the recommendations. Much more concerning is the fact that these social media posts have an effect offline. Back when the Syrian refugee crisis was at its peak, a team of researchers studying anti-immigrant hate crimes in Germany noticed that some towns had significantly more incidents than others. When they looked for causes, they found that towns with the most attacks on refugees were also the places where Facebook usage, not general internet usage, specifically Facebook, was significantly above the national average. We live in anger-inducing times. Some have called this the age of rage. An NPR poll found that 84% of Americans were angrier than a generation ago. We see signs of this anger everywhere. 51% of respondents to a AAA survey said that they get so angry when they drive that they tailgate on purpose. And 47% said they yell at other drivers. 1/3 said they use obscene hand gestures. I wish it were only harsh words and flippant gestures. Like the anti-immigrant Facebook posts, this anger leads to violence. The number of people shot in road rage incidents has risen over 400% in the last 10 years. 1 in 4 victims was killed. And we, here in Houston, drive some of the most dangerous roads in America, where in the last decade, 207 people have been shot. In the Talmud, Reish Lakish says, when a person becomes angry, if he is a sage, his wisdom departs from him. We've all known people who have been consumed by anger's fire, who have lashed out and hurt the ones they love. Many of us in this room struggle with our own anger. I know I do. The great 12th century doctor and sage Maimonides instructs us to purge anger from our lives completely. He writes, one should teach themselves not to get angry, even over a matter which befits anger. The life of the irate is not a true life. Now, Maimonides was an esteemed physician in his day, but he was not a neuroscientist. And modern brain science can give us insight into how anger functions and why it might be nearly impossible to take his advice and cut anger out completely. Doctors Alexandra Solomon and Dan Siegel teach it this way. Hold your hand up and make a fist with your thumb on the inside. This is your brain. Your wrist is the brain stem. It attaches to the spine. It controls basic bodily functions like breathing and swallowing. The next part of our brain, the thumb, this is the amygdala. It developed early in our species' evolutionary history. It's our monkey brain, our feeling brain. This is where your anger lives. Your fingers curved around your thumb, that's where you do most of your thinking. And at the very front, by your fingernails, that's the prefrontal cortex. Evolutionarily speaking, it's a relatively recent addition, home of our wisdom, our moral reasoning, our empathy, and our compassion. Now, while you're making that fist, imagine what you would do if your thumb suddenly got very hot. You'd lift your fingers. This is what happens when we get angry. We flip our lid. As Reish Lakish said, wisdom has departed. This is why we say or do regrettable things when we are angry. The part of our brain that knows better is no longer in the driver's seat. Our animal brain has taken the wheel. From this, we see how hard it would be to turn our anger off completely. It exists deep within us and in our history as a species. But we can master our anger if we can find ways to re-engage the prefrontal cortex, to bring those fingers back down. You can put your hands down. There's a Hasidic story about a couple who come to their rabbi because they are always fighting. The rabbi gives them a magic potion. Whenever they feel a fight arising, he tells them to each take a swig from the vial. But the potion only works, he says, if they hold it in their mouth for as long as they can before swallowing. A few weeks later, they're back in the rabbi's study, out of potion, but exuberant with gratitude. Their fights have been fewer, calmer, and more reasoned. Could they get more of this miraculous potion that was saving their marriage? Only then does the rabbi reveal that the bottle contained only water. What made all the difference was the moment of pause. This is the Jewish tradition's simple but powerful method for re-engaging our prefrontal cortex, slowing our anger down. Earlier this morning, we recited God's 13 attributes, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachun V'Chanun. We described God as Erech Apayim, slow to anger. We don't say that God is never angry. We say that God is slow to anger. Proverbs states, better to be slow to anger than mighty. Rabbi Yehiel Yitzhak Per calls this opening the space between the match and the fuse. When we can learn to slow our anger down, our prefrontal cortex re-engages, our wisdom, our morality, our compassion return. Anger is not our enemy. It is a part of our body's natural response to threats. It alerts us when something isn't right or isn't fair. Mindfulness teacher Juna Mustad says that when we learn to be Erech Apayim, when we are slow to anger, we can ask our anger this burning question: what do I need to see right now that I have been unwilling to face? The answer might lead us to face an injustice in our lives or even in the world. This is another story of rage. The year was 1911. A young Jewish labor organizer named Rose Schneiderman was furious. She had come to give the eulogy at a memorial service for women who had died in a factory fire. She was only 4 feet 9 inches tall, but she spoke with an incandescent fury matched only by her fiery hair. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in this city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The lives of men and women are so cheap and property so sacred. I can't talk fellowship. Too much blood has been spilled. Schneiderman's anger came from personal experience. She had dropped out of school when she was 13 and began working to help her single mother support their family. Like many female garment workers, Schneiderman quickly grew frustrated by gender disparities and dangerous working conditions in her factory. By age 21, she was organizing garment workers like herself to unionize. She helped lead the 1909 uprising of 20,000 New York shirtwaist workers. It was, at the time, the largest strike ever by female workers. This historic labor action had achieved significant concrete gains. Of the 315 clothing manufacturers involved in the strike, all but 14 had signed contracts granting most of the workers' demands for safer conditions and reasonable hours. But one of the 14 that had refused to sign was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. A little more than a year after the strike, the factory burned to the ground. 146 workers, almost all of them young women, died in the flames. This is why Rose Schneiderman stood at the funeral and furiously declared, "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting." But despite these harsh words, Rose Schneiderman's anger was not destructive, it was productive. Because it was an anger at injustice. It was an anger directed at the systems which put her and her sisters in harm's way. Rose's anger was righteous and it propelled her forward. Over the next decades, Schneiderman continued to fight for the rights of workers. In 1933, more than 20 years after the Triangle Fire, she was the first woman FDR appointed to the National Labor Advisory Board. There, she wrote the federal government codes for almost every industry with a predominantly female workforce. She instituted workplace safety requirements to prevent tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. She championed policies that are still protecting workers nearly a century later. The Koritzer Rebbe said, "I conquered my anger long ago. I do not allow it to consume me. I placed it in my pocket, and if I need it, I take it out." We have not been taught how to control and use our righteous anger in this way. In fact, quite the opposite. We've been taught to fear our anger. We've been taught to ignore it or to stuff it down, as if stuffing a high-energy particle into a small contained space wasn't the recipe for a dangerous explosion. Audre Lorde says that it is not our anger that will destroy us, but our refusal to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it, to tap that anger as an important source of empowerment, serving progress and change. Lorde also clarifies, "And when I speak of change, I do not mean temporary lessening of tensions, nor the ability to smile and feel good. I am speaking of a basic and radical alteration in those assumptions underlying our lives." And Audre Lorde knew that those who wish to maintain the status quo will be quick to dismiss our anger, and that some communities, especially minorities, are much more likely to have their anger dismissed. In her book, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger, Rachel Traster explains that women and people of color are regularly fed cultural messages that suggest that their rage is irrational, dangerous, or laughable. People tried to write off Rose Schneiderman's anger too. When she led a successful campaign to convince the New York State Assembly to protect female workers, her opponents launched a sham investigation to embarrass her. They branded her the Red Rose of Anarchy. Too often, those who wish to diffuse our righteous anger do so by saying that our anger is unbecoming. But for Schneiderman, the accusation that her anger was unladylike only added fuel to her sacred fire. Mary Beth Rogers, former chief of staff to Governor Ann Richards, writes that righteous anger is not based on sour resentments or false sense of entitlement. Rather, it is an anger that seethes at the injustice of life and transforms itself into compassion for those hurt by life. In this way, it is an emotion of hope, not of despair. She tells a story about Socorro, a small community of 20,000 people outside of El Paso. In the 1980s, despite the fact that there were 3,000 families living without running water, El Paso refused to extend the water line or other public services to the town. A middle-class, middle-aged woman went to volunteer at an elementary school in Socorro, where she met a little 7-year-old girl who was adorable but had a terrible odor. It took several weeks before the volunteer realized that the odor existed not because the child was dirty, but because she was bathing regularly in contaminated well water. The woman was furious. She couldn't get the thought of this girl and her living conditions out of her mind. One Sunday morning, she confided in her priest that she was too angry to enjoy even a bubble bath. She said, "For 6 months, I have been unable to take a bath in a tub full of water. I ration out only a small amount." He said to her, "You're not doing anyone any good by denying yourself. If you're angry, do something to help the people of Socorro get water." The priest introduced her to a community organizer named Ernesto Cortez, who believed that righteous anger was the energy necessary for action. Cortez taught people to harness that energy into what he called cold anger. For anger to be productive, it must be cooled from white-hot rage. Righteous anger is like a gas stove. We light it on high, but then we dial the temperature in until it's the right heat to cook. Too hot and it burns, too cold and nothing gets done. Ernesto Cortez compared this cold anger to the burning bush, which was on fire but not consumed. He called this a holy fire that never goes out, an unquenchable fire. It is powerful. It has force of its own. It is hallowed ground. Instead of letting her anger burn her into ash, Cortez taught her to listen to it and cool it into an effective organizing tool. She brought together others from Socorro and El Paso, each of whom used the flame of their own anger to ignite others as their movement grew. Within a few years, they won the fight. They brought clean water to Socorro. Rabbi Beth Clafter reminds us that anger is a primal force in our souls and in the universe. Feeling outraged about a situation in the world is our moral compass, alerting us that something is off course. Like the sound of the shofar, it reminds us to pay attention, to do what we can to repair and make things right. We live in the age of rage. Every day we are assaulted by images that threaten to make us flip our lids. Some of it designed in a lab by people who want to profit from our fury. But much of it is real and consequential and worth fighting for. Righteous anger is like gasoline. It is volatile, but it is also the fuel we need. We must slow our anger so that we can ask vital questions. What is my anger trying to tell me? Who benefits from my anger? Who should benefit? And we must cool our anger so that we can refine that crude oil into a powerful fuel. It has energy enough to light up the world. May 5785 be the year we stop letting others exploit our anger for their gain. The year we put our anger to work in the service of justice and love. The year our anger unites and does not divide. The year our anger builds and does not destroy. And may we tend to the flames that burn within us, so that they can shine through us as sacred fire. Shana Tova.